Good day, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is John Brandon. I'm Senior Director of International Relations Programs for the Asia Foundation in Washington, D.C. Our topic this morning is violent conflict, tech companies, and social media in Southeast Asia. Our discussion today is based on a report the Asia Foundation recently released under the same title. And if you go to our website at www.asiafoundation.org, you'll be able to download this report. I'm pleased to introduce you this morning to two of our principal authors of the report, Dr. Adam Burke and Benjamin Lakshin, as well as one of our partners in this project, Ms. Taik Ong from Myanmar. She is from MIDO, one of the highest profile and most active organizations in conflict mitigation, online initiatives, and as well as fostering community level peace building. Let me take a moment to introduce each of our speakers. Adam Burke is the Asia Foundation's Director of Conflict and Fragility. He's been with us since October 18, but it seems like I've known him longer. He's worked on foundation projects before joining us full-time. I met him first 15 years ago when he was doing work on conflict in southern Thailand. He has 20 years of experience working across Southeast and South Asia. He's a distinguished specialist in conflict, peace building, and development, having worked as a researcher and practitioner on many aspects of conflict prevention across the region. He's worked for the United Kingdom, the United Nations, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And prior to joining the foundation, some of his recent assignments have been an assessment for the Asian Development Bank on the risks associated with the reconstruction following the 2017 Siege of Marawi in Mindanao, Philippines, and a context analysis for the UN in support of efforts to counter communal violence in Sri Lanka. He will be our first speaker and sort of set the lay of the land. Our second speaker will be Ms. Taik Ong. She's the Executive Director of Myanmar ICT for Development Organization, also known as MIDO. And it's one of the few ICT-focused non-governmental organizations in Myanmar. MIDO focuses on ICTs for development, internet freedom, and internet policy advocacy. And MIDO organized the first Internet Freedom Forum in Myanmar. She's been involved in Myanmar's internet propagation events since the introduction of the internet to the public in Myanmar. She's also a digital security trainer for human rights defenders in Myanmar and is currently a DeBoer Fellow. Her engagement with MIDO stems from her involvement with the Myanmar Blogger Society, which was co-founded by her in April 2007. She is the project leader on Towards an Inclusive Information Society in Myanmar. The project is meant to increase the adoption and use of ICTs in the country. She will provide some case studies on online conflict and the role of Facebook. Our third speaker, Ben Lakshin, is a program officer with the Asia Foundation, where he plans and manages technology-driven development projects across the Asia-Pacific region. Ben's work focuses on developing new mobile and web platforms in Nepal and Thailand, and he contributes to research initiatives on digital financial services, digital literacy, and the impacts of online platforms across the region. Ben will talk about how high-tech companies can respond to the challenges that are being posed. For those of you who wish to ask questions, we ask that you pose them in the Q&A box, and if you would kindly identify yourself and your institutional affiliation when posing your questions. So our speakers know who they're talking to. And then I'm asking each of our speakers to speak for 12 minutes, which should leave enough time, ample time for questions and comments. So with that, let me turn the floor over to Adam. And again, thank you three very much for participating this morning and for all of you for coming. Adam?
Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining. The report that we've developed, Violent Conflict, Tech Companies and Social Media in Southeast Asia, is, I think, part of a broader journey for us at the Asia Foundation and for many other organizations operating in similar fields. I recently interviewed an expert on the impact of social media, the impact politically, the impact on conflict, called Sanjana Hatatua, who some of you may be familiar with. And right from the start of our discussion, he said, and I'll quote, "The term and concept of new media is outdated and outmoded. It's new only for you of a certain age. For those younger, and especially those in their teens today, new media is a meaningless phrase." So we've already moved on quite a long way. And what we're describing in this report is not an engaging new facet or a minor aspect of conflicts in Southeast Asia. It's part of the mainstream now. It's central to how politics play out, to how that can lead to violence, how armed groups organize, and how extremists mobilize. So in this report, we build a broad overview of common trends, focusing on case study material from Myanmar and from the Philippines. These are our case study countries, but we're not intentionally singling them out in any way, and we could have mapped trends in other Southeast Asian countries, Thailand, for example, or Indonesia, and indeed in South Asia and other regions. So these trends that we described, they run deep, and by now they're well established. The impact of social media, as we'll discuss during this session, can be especially severe in places where authorities enjoy more impunity, where conflicts and armed groups are commonplace, and where levels of media literacy among the public are lower. Conflict actors are increasingly adept at using online spaces to communicate with target audiences, to recruit new members, build coalitions, and counter opposing narratives with increasing sophistication. Meanwhile, governments, for their part, have drawn on disinformation techniques to implement sophisticated information operations that spread messages via fake Facebook accounts and false news stories, in cases intentionally contributing to communal and other forms of violence. In future, further change or progression in the same direction is likely as Southeast Asian conflict protagonists continue to increase their use of online platforms. Some groups, both governments and non-state groups, are only just gearing up. And also internet penetration is still increasing across less developed areas of Southeast Asia, which is itself, of course, a hugely varied region. In what I say today, in just a few minutes, I'm not going to simply run through the report because I think it stands on its own and that there's too much to cover in any case, but I'll try and pick out a few salient points from the Southeast Asian experience that we highlight. I'll deal with our case study countries, and first of all, some quick examples from Myanmar. As in any country, Myanmar shows diverse trends. It can be hard to generalize. The internet and social media have in many senses had extremely positive effects as the country has reformed and as people's lives overall, on average, have improved massively in recent years. But at the same time, recent conflict trends indicate the more insidious aspect of social media use. The context I'm addressing here is of widespread discrimination and, in cases, active violence against Muslim minorities within the country, seen most overtly against Rohingya in Rakhine State, but also affecting other Muslim groups in cities in particular across many different parts of Myanmar. So one example, in July 2014, violent riots spread across the city of Mandalay, stemming from the accusation that a tea shop owner had raped his Buddhist employee. The accusation was later found to be a false claim motivated primarily by business rivalries. Still, through amplification online, on Facebook in particular, which is the dominant platform in Myanmar, as in many countries, prominent extremists extrapolated and exacerbated the story, and it quickly became interpreted as an essentialist struggle. In ensuing violence, 2 people were killed, more than 20 were injured, and a mosque was burnt down. Social media platforms enabled extremist leaders from the network, known as Mabata, or the Patriotic Association of Myanmar, to increase their prominence and their influence, in particular the monk Wiratu. Such content has spread through social media and individual websites, along with offline material, DVDs, adhesive stickers, pamphlets, and so on. Wiratu gained hundreds of thousands of followers who further disseminated his posts. The arguments and rationale that he promoted were used to justify further discrimination and violence. Indeed, a UN fact-finding mission on Myanmar cited hate speech as a key factor, that's online hate speech, in provoking acts of violence, both in Rakhine State and elsewhere in the country. What happened in Mandalay was actually relatively small scale in comparison to events elsewhere. But notably, it was 6 years ago, right? So this is not just a very, very recent trend. More broadly, the role of governments in defining and manipulating narratives is of particular concern, and Myanmar is commonly cited as a country where such actions have been associated with subsequent acts of violence. Hundreds of pages operated by the military, including accounts openly attributed to top generals, were taken down by Facebook in the second half of 2018, following the UN fact-finding mission report. And what I'm saying now is this has been verified, it's been repeated in many quarters, it's nothing new or controversial. This major propaganda effort, which continued online for several years, involved managing pages under a variety of guises, including using the names of well-known celebrities. By identifying and removing these accounts, Facebook confirmed active manipulation of the system. Many of these popular pages had innocuous titles such as "Let's Laugh Casually" or "Young Women Teachers." So it was intentionally designed to seem innocuous and attractive to a broad audience. And in designing this content, but making it appear to be coming from citizens themselves, a popular ploy in many countries, these pages drew on techniques practiced in Russia and on Myanmar's own long experience with conventional forms of propaganda. These forms of violence are not new to Myanmar. There's a history of challenging relationships with Muslim communities and of scapegoating going back over 100 years. So it's not fair to say the violence is solely a product of social media, but it is clear that social media played a key role in it. I then move on briefly to the Philippines with a second briefer example, and in particular looking at the Siege of Marawi, which was a major and spectacular, for the wrong reasons, event in 2017, when a combined network of extremist groups took over the center of a small city, the city of Marawi in Mindanao, and held it for several months while under attack by the armed forces of the Philippines. The extremists who were involved presented long-term local conflicts that have been in operation, have been on running in Mindanao for many, many decades, and are primarily separatist political conflicts rather than ethnic or solely religious, that presented them as part of an international Islamic struggle, attacking young men disillusioned with current leadership and uniting previously divided militant groups. In the years before the siege, several groups pledged allegiance to ISIS leaders in Syria and Iraq. So you have a strong international flavor to this conflict in the Philippines. These pledges were shown on videos disseminated online, and extremists have consistently found ways around filters set up by platforms like YouTube. For example, by sharing links to private videos or by using other less monitored backup sites. And throughout the Marawi siege, militants produced sophisticated in-house video coverage, including drone footage of the ruined city and pleas from prominent hostages. Militants also relied on an app called Telegram, which has been in the news actually the last month or two, for their communication. It's a platform which offers high levels of privacy, and the field reports coming in from Marawi were also rapidly translated and shared in many different languages, internationally and regionally. Meanwhile, the armed forces of the Philippines conducted their own social media operations to discredit the claims they were confronting and promote their humanitarian efforts. While emphasis has understandably been given to the role of violent non-state armed groups in Marawi, reports have also shown how social media are systematically gamed by the government in the Philippines in order to spread disinformation and to isolate or soften up political rivals. So those are two examples. I could have come up with many more. Each one is unique and different. And one of the key lessons coming from our research is how varied the context is. In fact, when the research was being taken forward, our chief consultant in the early stages was really struggling to pull out comparative lessons just because of the degree of variety between places. And that's an important aspect for organizations moving forward and trying to take this work forward. It means that a lot of specific understanding of social media use in any one place needs to be built up before attempting any form of intervention to reduce conflict or otherwise ameliorate the situation. A second point, I think, is that social media are actually shifting how conflicts are fought. They're never the sole factor, but they do potentially, for example, reduce the need to hold territory in a conventional sense as part of warfare. Non-state groups may find it easier to operate through using online space rather than controlling physical space. So you see shifts in how conflict is actually happening. Third, and perhaps most importantly, social media is increasingly being used to manipulate public opinion. It's often states, governments, or actors within governments doing this. This is occurring in many Southeast Asian countries, as indeed it is elsewhere. The trend links with a broader authoritarian term, which has been broadly commented on, with a trend of populist regimes that are decreasingly democratic and often intentionally seek to polarize society by castigating minorities, building a sense of majority victimization in order to win votes and justify repression. These trends are being seen more widely, as I said, not only in Southeast Asia. So you have a very complex environment within which new social media, which aren't new anymore, as I said earlier, are being used as part of fundamental processes. Fourth, and finally, those engaged in trying to promote peace or in trying to maintain stability need to take these processes more seriously and equip themselves to respond. Emerging applications of new technologies have not yet been well documented or addressed in mainstream peace-building efforts across Southeast Asia. And that's different from some other regions in the Middle East, for example, in Europe, where there has been far more effort to build awareness and understanding of what's going on through these technologies and how they can be countered or adapted. Relevant fields include concerns over regulation, over information and media literacy, which NGOs, foundations, donor agencies and others all need to understand in different ways. Tech firms themselves, which we'll hear a little about later, are gradually becoming better equipped to respond, but there is a very long way to go. Some governments are increasingly responsive to the security risks generated by social media, particularly across Southeast Asia, but there's less understanding of how governments themselves can be made accountable for their own actions. So that's a very brief summary of what the report's attempting to emphasize and some points that build off it. I'll stop there and hand over to our next speaker.
Thank you, Adam. Tai, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, John. Thank you, Adam. So I hope you all can hear me fine. So I'm from MIDO, and we are a Myanmar-based local civil society organization working on the issues of digital rights. And we became active in this field of looking at social media in terms of countering online hate speech, disinformation in 2014, and that was when the Rohingya crisis, the first Rohingya crisis happened, and also when Facebook became a hotbed of for extremism and extremist organizations in Myanmar, and our organization is also a part of this network called Myanmar Tech Accountability Network, which is a network of Myanmar civil society organization coordinating efforts to mitigate the risks of social media-induced violence and political instability in Myanmar. So through that network, we also work a lot on monitoring, research, fact-checking, and also on platform advocacy as well. So through our experiences, I would like to share two examples from Myanmar in the issues of countering violent extremism online, and which depicts how platforms are actually very poorly, inadequately dealing with it. So, so the first thing is many of these global discussions and also the way of working for platform in terms of countering violent extremism online, it's very much focused on Muslim extremism and countering ISIS. Like for instance, you know, their way of propaganda, recruitment and fundraising. In the case of Myanmar, it's actually very different. What we are dealing with is the Mabata, which is a very big, prominent Buddhist extremism organization. And it is actually also very transnational in a way as well. And these Buddhist extremism groups have close links to groups in Sri Lanka, groups from Thailand, and also very closely ties to this Hindu Diva extremism organizations as well. And then, for instance, as some examples, in 2014, when it was the rise of Mabata, they received this award in Thailand, where Mabata was given the title as World Buddhist Outstanding Leader Award. And a lot of Thai Buddhist Nationalist Association are also working to try to fund organizations like Mabata in Myanmar as well. So so this nature of Buddhist extremism being very transnational and trying to take up the online space is becoming very much concerning, because like for example, because of what happened during in the Rohingya crisis in 2007, and a lot of criticism went to Facebook from international organizations, UN and such. Facebook, after that, Facebook, did a good job in, like for instance, utilizing things such as AI classifiers to moderate content about talking about Uwiratu, which is the leader of Mabata, or praising Mabata. And a lot of these contents were actually unable to, Facebook did prevent uploading and searching for this kind of content in the country as well. But what is worrying is these classifiers are, these Facebook classifiers are actually not applied anywhere else outside of Myanmar, where after the Mabata, rise of Mabata and Uwiratu in Myanmar, there has been repeatedly, this case has been repeatedly referred from other countries such as Thailand and India as well, about praising Uwiratu, praising Mabata, and how this kind of work that has been done in Myanmar by this Buddhist extremism group should be also done in this other countries as well. So that is actually very particularly worrying, because more Myanmar people are actually right now coming to use platforms such as Twitter and YouTube, which actually they don't have any policy targeting this Buddhist extremism groups such as Mabata or Uwiratu. So we think that this is actually becoming worrying in a way as well. And then another one is in terms of people who are working on this countering violent extremism in platforms, the experts and most staff working for tech companies tend to be more ISIS expert with little or no understanding about these anti-Muslim movements, and no understanding about culture and religious as of Buddhism and Hinduism as well. So this is one of this Myanmar case, which highlights, how it's actually different and how platforms need to have more resources and also understanding of context to actually deal with this kind of problems. So another problem is how this platform deals with ethnic organizations. So in Myanmar, we have a long and complicated history of these internal armed conflicts, which is, not as easy as, cases like, for example, ISIS, where, the government is a good guy and, the ISIS is the bad guy, where the government is trying to counter that. In Myanmar, we have, a lot of ethnic arms organizations, and how these platforms deal with, these organizations are actually very important. Like, for instance, when Facebook decided to ban the Arakan army in Myanmar on its platform, it also removed other ethnic arms organizations as well, which is actually, when looking at the, which is actually not implying to international standards and norms. So, these platforms and their policies around how do they define terrorist organizations is actually very important, and and how do they define ethnic organizations like what we have in Myanmar is also very it's very important, and if they are not doing a good job in that, it's actually contributing to a much more negative impact in country like us. So yes, so these are like the two main points of what I wanted to share on the Myanmar aspect.
Thank you, Taik Taik. Ben, over to you.
Thanks, John. And thanks, Taik Taik and Adam, for really setting up the issue in a really nice way, in particular for Taik Taik, the really specific examples he gave about issues in Myanmar, and the really challenges that you've had to deal with within your network. I'm gonna say the dreaded words here. I'm gonna try to share my screen. I think it should work, but we'll give it a shot here. All right, are we good? All right, Adam's nodding. So Adam and Taik Taik talked a little bit about the conflict situation. I'm really not a conflict expert. I focus on technology. Technology and the internet and how societies interact with it around the region. And so I'm going to talk about how tech companies have responded to these kinds of issues, what kind of tools they have in their toolbox right now, and where some of the gaps are, both on the side of the tech companies and also civil society and other organizations that are trying to engage with them. So first, it might be useful to think about how we define responsibility and liability for platform companies. These would be, different things. Responsibility might be a moral determination. Liability should be encoded in local or national laws. And I'm going to lay out a few different scenarios here to kind of illustrate the breadth of problems and challenges that exist. There could be an infinite variety of these scenarios, but I'll just lay out a few. So this first scenario is a violent group might use a platform to raise money or send money. This is pretty well defined, I think, in legal frameworks with anti-money laundering or countering funding of terrorism laws, although there are gray areas here as well. A more tricky situation, but still a little bit well defined, is when a known violent group is actively using the platform to propagandize, promote themselves, or promote their acts of violence. There are certain, agreements or even draft legislation that would prevent this or provide some liability for this. For for example, the Christchurch call is a statement made by governments and also platform companies after the Christchurch attacks in 2019. There's also draft EU legislation that I think is being negotiated right now that would require platform companies to report content by violent groups more proactively, even within 1 hour of it being posted. That is controversial in its own right, but that's another legal framework that's being discussed. And then in the US, of course, we have the Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which actually protects, if anything, it protects the moderation actions taken by tech companies to remove this content, and allows platforms to remove content that they consider obscene or violent or harassing or otherwise objectionable. Another situation that we can think about is what if a state actor is the one putting up this content? This becomes even more tricky because that's probably not going to be prosecuted by a national, legal system, but maybe there are some states that are doing objectionable things on social media. There are cyber norms discussions that are going on right now that are trying to define what is acceptable state behavior in cyberspace. This, for the most part, includes cyber attacks and things like that. And to a lesser extent, the discussion seems to touch on issues on social media and influence operations, but these issues are increasingly connected, where cyber attacks flow into disinformation operations and other types of activities on social media. And at platforms themselves, I think there's a better consensus around this of preventing and reporting what Facebook calls coordinated inauthentic behavior, or what Twitter calls information operations, and labeling state accounts and things like that. Lastly, this more unclear situation where a platform might not be actively doing anything, and even individuals might not be actively trying to game it, but somehow the recommendation algorithms on the platform encourage people to form into groups that become increasingly radicalized and fuel the growth of violent groups and ultimately lead to violent actions. This has actually been litigated in US courts, at least. There's a case called Force versus Facebook, where the plaintiffs were arguing that Facebook's recommendation algorithm radicalized people into Hamas, I believe, which then carried out an attack and killed or wounded somebody. The court's determination was that Facebook is protected from that by Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, but this is a kind of a new gray area that I think the act wasn't originally written with that in mind. And really there's not a clear consensus or legal framework to define who's liable or who's responsible here. So let's move on from this. Let's say we have some consensus about a certain action. We understand that something should be done about content on a platform. What do platforms actually, what can they actually do? So these are, I tried to list out some of the options that they have for dealing with this, starting from kind of the more nitty-gritty practical things they can do, going on to more externally facing or partnerships that they can form. This graph on the right side was actually just published a couple of weeks ago by Facebook. It's one of the first this type that I've seen them put out, where they actually talked about the prevalence of hate speech on their platform. It was pretty interesting. But you can see that over the course of just a couple of years, Facebook has dramatically increased the use of algorithms to manage content, to detect nefarious or violent or hateful content and remove it automatically. This graph, I think, is, on one hand, it shows how quickly the technology can be developed to deal with this. On the other hand, it shows that we're going to be relying increasingly on these kind of black box algorithms to do this content moderation work. And it's almost certainly the case that these algorithms work much better for English and maybe other large global languages than for smaller minority languages or even national languages in Southeast Asia. We already have reports from Facebook saying that the rate of user reporting of content is lower in places like Myanmar, or it was in the past at least. And another caveat to put on this is that in the same post from Facebook, they showed their data from Instagram as well, where they had only reported data starting from the last quarter of 2018, I believe. And that jumped from about 40% detection rate to 95% within the last 12 months, so going from about 40% of content detected by algorithms versus 60% from users, all the way up to 95% in about a 12-month time span. It's almost certainly the case that smaller platforms do not have the same quality of algorithms to deal with this. And so they're going to be relying even more on user reporting, which is not giving them a complete picture of what's happening. The other tools that are in the kind of metaphorical toolbox for platforms to deal with this violent content or violent groups, there are trust and safety teams that usually deal with escalations and look at what the issues that might be more unclear. They work with law enforcement when that comes into play. And there are independent researchers and journalists, fact checkers, civil society organizations that either formally or informally pressure tech companies to act on content by violent groups. We see this all over the world, but in particular in places where civil society is better equipped to detect and describe these issues. And then finally, some companies, for example, Facebook, have funded counter-speech programs, behavioral research, and other types of development work or civil society work. So when we talk about partnerships, we go into this a little bit in the paper, and I think a lot of the people on this webinar might even know more about these particular models, but I just put up a few logos of a few different partnership models that exist where either civil society groups have partnered with each other, or they have partnered with tech companies, or tech companies partner with each other to try to better address this problem, better understand it. So, on one end of the spectrum, there's something like the Facebook Oversight Board, which they call just the Oversight Board because I think there's an idea that ultimately someday it might be generalized to more than just Facebook products. That's a relatively siloed organization compared to the others. There's the GIFCT, which is a consortium put together by platform companies, tech companies, but also including some civil society participation. This was envisioned as a kind of clearinghouse where companies could share basically encrypted versions of harmful content with each other so that they can better build automated systems to detect and remove it. This initiative has been a little bit controversial because it had relatively little civil society participation at the beginning, but I think it seems to be improving. They're taking the criticism to heart. There's Tech Against Terrorism, which is an initiative launched by the United Nations Counterterrorism Executive Directorate. They work with the tech company, and they recently started a terrorist content analytics platform, which seems like an interesting model. I don't know the effectiveness of it quite yet because it's just been launched, but they actually email alerts directly to tech companies when they see examples of quote unquote terrorist content on the platforms, which I believe, to TechTech's point, just includes ISIS and far right groups. And then finally, a couple of partnerships that are not dealing directly with violence, but maybe are important to think about nonetheless. There's the IFCN, which Facebook and other platforms rely on to do fact checking and to guide their flagging and removal decisions. And in the US, there's, I think, an interesting example of this election integrity partnership, which played an important role in our election here in the US, in pressuring tech companies to develop policies for different types of outcomes for the election, different types of forms of misinformation or disinformation that might be posted on platforms. And this is a partnership between several different institutions that are focused on disinformation and misinformation online, including Stanford Internet Observatory, program on the Graphica, the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab, and the University of Washington Center for an Informed Public. So I'll be brief here on these last few slides. All of this, I think, has been clear by Adam and TechTech's remarks. This is all very challenging to apply to Southeast Asia. For one thing, because it's It's harder in some cases to define where platforms are responsible or where they're liable due to the nature of the conflict space. There's so many localized and smaller armed groups. They have different roles that they play within society. States also, in some cases, are protagonists within conflicts. And the tools that are in the toolboxes that platforms are trying to use, the content moderation methods are not always adapted to the region, particularly the algorithms that they're using. There seems to be a lower rate of user reporting because users may not be that comfortable or familiar with using the report button that platforms ostensibly rely on. And then again, echoing what Tech said, staffing, there's not local staffing or not high-level high-level staff who are knowledgeable about particular local contexts in Southeast Asia. And then finally, there are relatively few prominent research partnerships or initiatives. I think the Myanmar Tech Accountability Network that Tech described is an important one to look closely at. But those are not particularly common across the region. And I think there could be a lot more. So closing point, things are not great, but we could definitely do more. There's a lot more evidence-based research or independent monitoring that could be done. More development of domestic, regional, and global policy and discussion of norms around behavior in cyberspace. Advocating towards platforms to reform the whole trust and safety process and the way that they go about moderating content. And then finally, innovation in peace building and conflict reduction. So I'll stop there and we can go on to questions because I saw a few already came in.
Thank you very much, all, to the three of you. Yes, we do have some questions that have come in, and let us begin. Lucy Mize from USAID's Asia Bureau here in Washington asked the question, are there platforms like Parler that by ethos don't want to use algorithms to detect hate speech because they are actually in favor of some of the ideas that others might deem hate speech? Is there anyone want to take a crack at that who would like to go first?
I'll say something that I think Adam was going to say, okay. Answer as well, but I think, I don't know if Parler is a great example because I think they were created maybe without thinking about how they would scale all their systems up or without really clearly defined policies. I mean, as much as we might hate what Facebook does in certain instances or criticize it, they have one of the most sophisticated and built out systems for content moderation. And most other platforms just don't have that because they haven't had to scale to that extent. So I think even if there is a platform that doesn't want to use algorithms, and there are some that basically don't because they're small, if they were to scale to the extent that Facebook has or another platform, they would have to employ some algorithms, otherwise things would just really get out of control. So yeah, that's what I'd say.
Okay. Adam, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, a couple of points. It's an interesting question. I think I'll have to answer it obliquely because I'm not a tech expert, to be honest. But from the fields where I have been working, first of all, one core point is that organizations may not want to use algorithms to detect hate speech, but they do want to use algorithms because the algorithms that drive people to more extreme or polarized views are often the very same algorithms that generate significant advertising revenue. They create more clicks, they encourage people to click on more and more, and with the clicks come more advertising. So there's a clear connection between a profit incentive and not cracking down on it. And I think that's a common trend. It's not impossible to crack that either through all sorts of ways, whether it's through regulation or through other softer means. The second point is that there's often an expectation that platforms are from developed countries, and particularly from the US, and particularly within the US, from Northern California. And of course, that's very much not the case. They can be from all over the place. So what's hate speech for a platform that's based in Russia or Dubai or Japan or China may be very, very different from a platform that's based in somewhere in a Western country, or indeed a Southeast Asian country. And in that regard, it is a complex and difficult terrain where the machinery to cope with this on an international level is not necessarily there, and that there are vast grey areas out there which are still being explored and need a lot more work, as Ben was saying.
Okay. Our next question is from Michael Martin, who's with the Congressional Research Service here in Washington. He says, could you talk more about the treatment of ethnic armed organizations by social media companies versus treatment of the Union government and the Tatmadaw? For example, did the branding of the Arakan Army as a terrorist organization by Aung San Suu Kyi and General Min Aung Hlaing contribute to Facebook's decision to ban the Arakan Army? Also, this is a two-part question. For Ben Lockshin, how would he suggest addressing governments utilizing misinformation to possibly influence social media companies and their algorithms to ban or restrict access to their political rivals? So Adam and Tiger Adam, why don't you address the first question?
Yes, if I may answer that, thank you for the question, Michael. So actually, the takedown of the Arakan Army from Facebook actually took place before the government designated the Arakan Army as a terrorist group. So it actually happened before that. And then at that time, and even until now, Facebook doesn't actually have a very good, definition of terrorism, and also on its, designating protocol of, how they are like designating armed groups on as well. And then it is also actually Facebook also don't include governments or military in their dangerous organization designation. And I think you all might be aware that the Myanmar military Tatmadaw has been banned from Facebook, but then the action take against the Myanmar military don't actually have a formal policy basis. It wasn't declared as a dangerous organization. Facebook just banned it because of the names that is included in the UN report and say is associated with accusation of ethnic cleansing and genocide. So yeah.
Adam, would you care to add anything, or?
Not specifically about that precise example, but there are clearly vast grey areas that are currently open to interpretation, and you see that where numerous cases in India has been prominent in this regard recently, but many other places as well, where tech companies have been disinclined to penalize a government online for their actions because it's not in their interest to do so for obvious reasons if they want to operate in that country. And so one rule is applied to one group, different rules are applied to other groups, and it's a complex and messy terrain. What I think you saw in Myanmar partly was Facebook trying to be even-handed by placing sanctions of the sort that they can on both sides or all sides in a way that was a political tightrope that they were trying to pull off. And these are efforts that are being taken forward in an exploratory fashion in very serious circumstances. So it's a challenging and messy environment. It's what you see coming through. But Ben, you may want to answer the second question.
Sure. I think like for this question and also more generally, there's really maybe two things that are part of the solution, I'll say, to all sorts of online harms, including misinformation or disinformation that could be promoted by governments. Those things would just be transparency and local knowledge. I think if platforms have some local knowledge within their policy teams, they would be able to understand whether a government is trying to manipulate them or suggest something that is false. And if there's some degree of transparency about the actions that a company has taken, to restrict access or ban certain groups, then the public and the civil society actors could evaluate whether platforms are being fair in the actions that they're taking or whether they're being manipulated in some way. And if they are, then they would be able to put some pressure on the company to reverse course or reconsider how they reach that decision. I think those are really the only options.
Okay. Well, I'll take the prerogative of the chair. I don't see any other questions up right now. Adam, in your initial remarks, you talked about sort of the internationalization of, I guess, the situation in Marawi, where you were looking at, I think it was Telegram and the different chat rooms and using this platform to publish in a variety of languages, English, Arabic, Bahasa, Tagalog, I think maybe a couple of others. And it was interesting. I was looking at a report not too long ago. It was published by West Point, and they were saying that in terms of terrorism in Southeast Asia before 2017, it was about 6% of those terrorist acts were sort of had an international component or instigated by international actors. But by 2019, that was up to 59%. And so I think that point, it makes really illustrates what you were saying before. Let me pose a question about, there seems to be this fine line in terms of how do you distinguish between powerful political expression from hate speech and criminal intent, and how can governments and social media work to try to address this? And so I guess that's probably a question for both you, Adam, and Ben, but I would invite Tyke to share any thoughts she might have about that.
Okay, well, I'll come first if that's okay. I think that the internationalization, clearly one focuses on international extremist Muslim groups, and that's still a clear concern that runs on. I think it's a small element of important but small element of international aspects of extremism and violence on social media. So you see it happening in many ways, and some of which are, might be deemed politically progressive, if you want to use that word, such as the Milk Tea Alliance of East and Southeast Asian activists protesting in favor of democracy in Hong Kong and Taiwan and Thailand and so on. Some of them are more conservative and in cases violent. For instance, the ways in which Buddhist movements across the region, which Tyke can probably talk about at far greater length than me, have linked up. So that there are clear links between people like Wiratu in Myanmar and Buddhists who have encouraged violence in Sri Lanka, using the same discourse, exchanging ideas and symbols. Both of these groups quote, for instance, the destruction of the Buddhas in Bamiyan in Afghanistan by the Taliban as justification and example of the oppression that they're concerned that they will suffer from. So you have big international discourses taking place very rapidly and penetrating very deeply across a whole range of fields. And then, of course, the platforms themselves are international. All of this, when you look at it within Southeast Asia, creates many challenges. And Ben was talking about some of the really positive aspects of actions that have been taken and can still be taken to address some of the potential problems with these four scenarios that he put up. If you think through the capabilities and capacities for taking that forward across Southeast Asia, especially with challenges and risks that are coming from outside the area, they're a lot weaker than they would be in many Western countries or non-Western developed countries, in terms of the capacity for civil society to act, in terms of the scope for independent, rigorous and free journalists to explore issues and concerns, and in terms of legal frameworks and capacities to define whether an act of violence or an act of discrimination or extreme speech is acceptable or not. All of this in many countries is not well defined and is heavily influenced by those who hold the levers of power. So you have a huge challenge on your hands in many Southeast Asian countries, which speak a multiplicity of languages and have other aspects and qualities that make it particularly difficult to take all this forward. And there are some real challenges out there that are going to remain difficult to address for a long time to come. And I think related to that, and that there are differences of opinion out there as to what extent this can be done voluntarily, or to what extent this needs some form of tighter and clearer regulation and control of what's going on in different ways. If you're taking the latter line, that it needs more regulation, of course, who should be doing the regulating? How can you trust the regulators when all actors, whether they're politically powerful or whether they're marginal, may be the ones trying to game the system? And in that regard, a lot of people point towards the need to have international norms, standards, and regulations established as a basis which underpins where nations within Southeast Asia would be able to take things forward. So a foundation on which they can build. So even the response is highly internationalized as well.
Thank you. Ben?
John, would you mind repeating your question once more so I can make sure I get the right point here?
Basically, I asked about distinguishing, I think Adam has pretty much answered this, the distinguish between peaceful political expression from hate speech and criminal intent. Yeah, but the other part to the question was, what's the relationship between governments and social media to help address this? So maybe that's the part.
Yeah, I think it's a huge question, and there's no really easy answer that I could give here. I mean, that question spans not just this issue of violent conflict, but all sorts of other political questions, and even to reference another paper that we've been working on recently, COVID response. How does a government deal with false and harmful information about COVID online without unduly restricting people's speech? Again, I'll just repeat the points I said earlier, particularly transparency. That's really the only way that outsiders are able to understand what's happening within the platforms, because otherwise there's really no way to tell whether lines have been crossed between permitted political speech versus organizing towards violent ends. And I think, maybe another thing to think about is that when we talk about moderation and actions by platform companies, it doesn't have to be an all or nothing decision that is taken. I think we see this a lot more in the US right now with the election and also with the COVID information that's being spread on social media. The decision that platform companies have to make now, it doesn't necessarily have to be, do I take this content up, or do I keep this content up, or do I take it down? It can also be like labels that get put on it, or adjustments to algorithms in order to prioritize truthful information. And so I think adjusting the way we think about content on social media and actions by social media companies to consider these other types of actions that could be taken that don't necessarily remove content or silence people, but instead adjust to enable the users to see more context or see expert opinions alongside other, informal content. Those might be more viable ways to deal with this.
Thank you. Tai, would you like to add anything to this question from a Myanmar perspective?
Yes, I just have a bit to add. So one thing is, what are the roles of platforms and also the government is what's happening in Myanmar is actually, government are often the part of the problem. So, when we look at the Mabata, the Buddhist extremist organization, is actually very closely tied with the military, and big political parties as well. So in this case, the government are actually a part of a problem, and when particularly when international organizations work with government, they actually should take this into a very they should really consider this when trying to put government as a main partner in the program as well. Like for instance, we have cases where we are put into this group of stakeholders where the police is in, the government is in, where we are talking about disinformation and misinformation on social media, where the main actors who are actually instigating this are actually from the government as well. So that's actually one thing that should we take note of. Another one is in terms of platforms. Platforms actually, we in our observation and in our work with our monitoring on social media and advocacy with platforms actually don't have a proper way to deal with actors. When we say actors, they often associated actors with accounts, which is actually very problematic and useless, because when we say these actors are bad actors, but then what they see as actors, they just see it as one particular account or two particular accounts. So I think this is also a shortfall in for the platform part as well.
Okay, thank you. I'm looking at the Q&A. There aren't any other questions. Well, let me just pose one last question unless someone brings something up. What next? You've done this report. What other issues might you look at that stems from this this report you have written? And Taik, I also invite you to offer what Mito might be doing next. And so, Adam, why don't I start with you? So
the simplest answer is I'm open to further discussion, further engagement, and interested ideas from the participants in this meeting and elsewhere on how to take this agenda forward and what useful role we as the Asia Foundation can play. I think more specifically, for many Southeast Asian countries and other Asian countries as well, particularly developing Asian countries, they're going to struggle on their own. And there's a lot of support that can be taken forward, and a lot of relationship building, networking, exchanging of experiences, building and constructing common positions across countries that are worth emphasizing and supporting. And that can be through governmental channels. There's work with ASEAN that's already going on, for example. It can be through civil society channels, or it can be under the auspices of other international or regional parties. So I think that whole area of where to take forward the response, where regulation can be encouraged, where responses of tech platforms can be improved, what advice is needed for governments, for civil society actors and others to take this whole agenda forward is something that we and many others can contribute to in the coming years. And it's not going to go away. This problem is going to get more severe. When you look at some of we've talked specifically about conflict and particular kinds of conflict in Southeast Asia. If you blow it open to look at politics and the impact on politics and political trends of ways in which social media can be gamed, this is sort of epochal in its impact. If you have in the early 20th century, you had new forms of radio, of film, and then of television coming in and radically shifting how politics happened and pushing things towards more extremist positions, whether it's far right or far left. I mean, it's established that shifting communications and media patterns were a core part of the vast problems the world faced in the first half of the 20th century. And in the first half of the 21st century, we're in a very similar position with a new set of technologies, and these are issues that everyone needs to grapple with.
Ben?
Yeah, first of all, there is a lot that people like us can do, even outside platform companies. I think there, in the past few years when I've talked to people about this, I often hear kind of a sense of fatalism, like, oh, it can be frustrating, honestly, to deal with these things when platform companies hold so much of the power over how content is presented on their platforms or how removal decisions are taken. But there are a lot of things that civil society can do to push for transparency, to do their own research, to implement different kinds of programs that take into account online issues or speech and interactions that happen online. I think Adam and Tyke are both doing a lot of interesting projects around those. And I think overall, what would be great to see is for Southeast Asian organizations and leaders to take a more active role in international discussions about these issues, because right now, so much of the discussion about conflict on social media and even just broader discussions of online speech and content moderation are dominated by the West and by Europe and the US, and by discussion about ISIS and transnational Islamist extremist groups, and to some extent far-right extremists. So just having more Southeast Asian voices at the table and understanding the issues of the region better, I think would be a huge first step in allowing us to figure out what are the proper ways forward even.
Thank you. Tyke, would you like to offer any final words?
Yes, yes, thanks, John. I actually agree very much with Adam and also Ben as well, particularly on the context of Southeast Asia, where it's actually very different from where most discourse around social media is happening, in the global north. So it's actually very different. So we would like the platforms and also international actors to have to put much more voices from this region region in this big discussions, particularly on content moderation and on platforms as well. And another one is I really want to stress again about conceptualization of online countering online violence and terrorism on the lens of ISIS is actually very not really relevant in country like Myanmar and other Southeast Asia country as well. So that should be really put into consideration. And another one is we should really take and talk to the local groups, because it's actually very important to engage with local civil societies, because when international organizations and when they try to parachute approaches actually fail, they don't understand the risks and are often very idealistic. So talking to local groups, including local organizations or local civil societies, are actually very, very important as well.
Thank you. We pretty much have come up to the bewitching hour. I want to thank the three of you for your very thoughtful comments and congratulate you on the report. I hope it's very well. I hope it's well read by people here and who have participated this morning, and as well as for those who haven't participated, who might go to the Asia Foundation's website. This is, as I said, a very interesting webinar. Thank you for speaking this morning. I want to thank those of you who are participating and who posed questions, and our meeting will be adjourned until the next time. So thank you very much for listening and contributing. Bye-bye. Stay well.